Dad's flag came home without him. It arrived in a rigid white box, edges sharp enough to cut if you handled it carelessly. The officer who carried it stood straight on our porch, hat tucked under his arm, voice measured. He did not rush. He did not hesitate. He delivered the sentence the way men deliver verdicts. Killed in action. Pacific Theater. Classified mission. Details unavailable. My mother folded into herself before he finished speaking. Her hand found the doorframe as if the house needed to hold her upright. My stepfather moved immediately, efficient, practical. He thanked the officer. He guided my mother inside. He closed the door. I stood there a moment longer with the box in my hands. It was heavier than it looked. There was no coffin, no watch, no boots, no personal effects, sealed in plastic. Just the flag and an envelope with my name written in my father's handwriting. Not printed, written. Lillian. The officer asked if I wanted grief counseling resources. I told him no. He nodded once, relieved to have a clear answer, and walked back down the steps. Inside, my mother placed the box on the mantel above the fireplace. She lit a candle beneath it. The flame trembled in the draft from the air vent. My stepfather adjusted it slightly so the wax wouldn't drip onto the wood. "We need to accept this," he said that evening at the kitchen table. "The Navy doesn't make mistakes about things like this." My mother's eyes were red but dry. "Your father died serving his country. That's what matters." I didn't respond. I have never believed in arguing with people who need something to be finished. I waited until the house went quiet. The hallway light clicked off. My stepfather's footsteps faded. The pipes hummed once and settled. I carried the envelope into my old bedroom and closed the door without locking it. Locking doors invites questions. I sat on the edge of the bed and broke the seal carefully. Inside was a small black access key. Military-grade encryption, not standard issue. I recognized the weight of it immediately. It wasn't something handed out casually. There was also a single sheet of paper. Find Mariner. No signature, no explanation, no punctuation. Just that. My father was not a man who wrote puzzles. He valued clarity. He corrected my grammar when I was 9. He believed words should land where they were intended. Find Mariner meant something precise. The official report had described his final assignment as part of a classified communications program in the Pacific. Project Mariner, experimental long-range signal architecture, a systems malfunction during a live test, vessel lost, crew presumed dead. Presumed. The word had felt small when I first read it. Now it felt deliberate. The public summary was 4 pages long. 4. I laid the paper flat on my desk and stared at it until the letters blurred. If he had known he was going to die, he would have written goodbye. He would have written something practical, insurance policy location, safety deposit instructions. He had written, "Find Mariner," which meant he had not expected to die, or he had expected me not to believe that he did. The next morning, I requested his full service record through a former colleague who owed me a favor. Civilian contracting work has its own channels. Paper moves when you know where to apply pressure. 3 weeks passed. At dinner, my stepfather began sorting through my father's belongings. He did it methodically. File cabinets, desk drawers, uniform jackets. "We don't need to keep everything," he said. "It's healthier to move forward." My mother agreed too quickly. I watched from the doorway and memorized which boxes he labeled for storage and which he labeled for disposal. When the file finally arrived, it was heavily redacted. Entire sections blacked out, paragraphs reduced to shadows. But the structure remained. Project Mariner, initiated under Navy Communications Command. Objective: deploy experimental signal array with extended maritime range. Outcome: mission failure. Crew status: presumed KIA. Attached to the appendix was a directive bearing a signature I recognized. Admiral Richard Thorne. The order was brief. No recovery authorized. Retrieval not advised due to strategic risk. No recovery, not unable, not unsuccessful. Authorized. I sat back in my chair and felt something inside me align. Not anger, not grief, clarity. No recovery meant someone had made a decision not to look. My father had commanded that vessel. He had survived 2 deployments that were never publicized. He had built redundancy into systems no one else understood. He did not fail quietly. If there had been wreckage, someone would have documented it. If there had been bodies, someone would have buried them. There had been neither. I booked a flight to Washington without informing my mother. I told her I had to meet with legal counsel about estate paperwork. She seemed relieved that I was handling something practical. The Pentagon is designed to disorient. Corridors repeat themselves. Offices look identical. Windows are rare. Admiral Thorne's assistant tried to deny my meeting request. I remained in the waiting area for 4 hours. I did not fidget. I did not check my phone. I waited. Eventually, I was escorted inside. Thorne's office was controlled in every detail. Framed commendations aligned perfectly. A model aircraft carrier centered on the shelf behind him, the carpet thick enough to muffle steps. He stood when I entered. "Ms. Morgan," he said evenly, "I'm sorry for your loss." I placed the redacted directive on his desk. "You signed this." He looked at it but did not touch it. "Yes." "No recovery," I said. "It was a strategic decision." "Based on what?" He folded his hands. "We had credible intelligence indicating escalation risk if assets were deployed." "Escalation with whom?" "That information remains classified." I held his gaze. "Were there remains?" A pause. "We received no confirmation of survival." "That wasn't my question." He leaned back slightly. The first small shift. "The Pacific is vast, Ms. Morgan. Sometimes recovery is impossible. But you authorized not attempting it." Silence. For a moment, doubt flickered across his expression. It was small. Most people would have missed it. I did not. "You're chasing something that will not bring him back," he said finally. "I'm not trying to bring him back," I replied. "I'm trying to determine whether he left." I stood before he could respond. Outside, the air felt less filtered. I walked 2 blocks before allowing myself to breathe fully. Doubt in an admiral is not accidental. Back in my hotel room, I examined the access key more closely. It wasn't registered under Central Navy systems. It linked to a contractor network that had supported experimental signal research in the late 90s. Most of those facilities had been decommissioned. Most. One location remained listed as inactive but not fully dismantled: Nevada. Desert installations are ideal for things that require isolation. I rented a car the next morning. The drive stretched for hours under a flat sky. The land looked abandoned long before the facility appeared. Concrete structures half buried in sand, faded warning signs, no visible security. The gate scanner recognized the key. The metal barrier lifted slowly. That told me everything. Inside, the air was stale but powered. Emergency lighting flickered in narrow corridors. Dust layered the consoles, but the systems were not dead. Project Mariner had not ended. It had relocated. In the central operations room, I found server racks still active, backup generators humming quietly, archived logs labeled under isolation protocol. Isolation, not fatality. Crew contained due to communications instability following array malfunction. Contained. I read the line 3 times. The failure had not destroyed the vessel. It had compromised a classified signal array that interfered with civilian frequencies and foreign military channels. The political risk had been significant. Declaring the crew dead had been simpler. No scandal, no hearings, no public scrutiny. Folded flags require less explanation than technical disasters. I moved deeper into the facility. One terminal remained active on an emergency channel, low frequency, manual override. I sat down. "This is Lillian Morgan," I said calmly into the microphone, "requesting response from any Mariner personnel." Static filled the room. I waited. 30 seconds, a minute, then a distortion. "Lil, My pulse did not change. I never died. It was his voice, older, thinner, but steady. Captain Daniel Morgan, alive. I did not cry. I did not speak his name again. Instead, I recorded the transmission. There would be time for emotion later. Evidence comes first. I began copying server logs, personnel records, containment orders, rotational transfer documentation spanning decades. They had been moved between secured sites under administrative death status, erased on paper, preserved in silence. When I finally stepped back outside, the desert wind had shifted. Sand moved in slow arcs across the ground. The world had declared him finished. It had simply stopped looking. I did not speak again after I heard his voice. The silence that followed was not empty. It was controlled. "Lil," the transmission had said, faint, distorted, human. I replayed the recording once to confirm it was not interference. The tone matched, the cadence, the pause before my name. My father never rushed syllables. I never died. There was no panic in his voice, no desperation, just a statement of fact. I shut down the microphone and began documenting everything in the room: server identifiers, isolation logs, transfer authorizations. I photographed the racks. I copied archived directives onto an encrypted drive I carried for fieldwork. The system was old, but the redundancies were careful. Whoever maintained this facility understood procedure. The logs told a slow story. Project Mariner had not failed in the way the public summary described. The signal array had achieved something unexpected. It extended beyond projected range and bled into restricted channels. Civilian aviation frequencies flickered. Foreign radar installations detected phantom signatures. For 12 minutes, global communications experienced a distortion that could not be publicly explained. The Navy called it a malfunction. Other agencies called it exposure. The crew had not died in the Pacific. They had been ordered into containment pending evaluation of neurological and physiological effects from prolonged proximity to the array. The isolation protocol began 48 hours after the incident. Administrative death status was applied within the week. No recovery authorized. The phrase returned, not to avoid bodies, to avoid questions. I found a secondary file marked Internal Risk Assessment. It referenced Admiral Thorne directly. His signature appeared again beneath a paragraph that read, "Continuation under controlled conditions, preferable to public disclosure of systemic vulnerability." Continuation. The project had not ended. It had been buried. I moved to the communications terminal again. "This is Lillian Morgan," I said evenly. "Confirm identity." There was static, then breathing. "Captain Daniel Morgan," he replied after a delay. "Commanding Officer, Project Mariner." His voice was thinner than I remembered. Age had settled into it, but the structure remained intact, measured, controlled. "How long?" I asked. 30 years, he said, give or take. The words did not land all at once. They arranged themselves slowly. "Are you physically restrained?" I continued. "No." "Monitored?" A pause. "Yes." I glanced at the ceiling. The facility was active but minimally staffed. Automated systems handled most of the containment protocols. I had not encountered personnel since entering. "Where are you?" I asked. "Rotational sites," he answered. "Desert, Arctic, maritime platforms. Depends on budget cycles." Budget cycles. I absorbed that quietly. "Why?" I asked. Another pause. Longer this time. "The array worked," he said finally. "Too well. It revealed vulnerabilities in global infrastructure. They could not admit that publicly. We were the cleanest solution." "You were declared dead." "Yes." "And you agreed?" "I followed orders." The answer was immediate, not defensive, not regretful. "Do you want extraction?" I asked. Silence stretched across the line. "I want the truth documented," he said. "Extraction would escalate." Escalate. The same word Thorne had used. I have access to oversight channels, I said. Congressional review, Inspector General. That will trigger investigation, he replied. Investigation will expose the technology. It already has, I said quietly. It exposed itself. I could hear faint background noise on his end, machinery, ventilation, controlled air. Lil, he said after a moment, and the tone shifted slightly. If you pursue this, you will not be offered compromise. They will offer you silence. I know. Silence is comfortable. Yes. But it corrodes. Yes. The line remained open. I found the no recovery order, I said. He exhaled once, not surprised. Thorne was pragmatic, he said. He believed in systems. And you? I believed in mission completion. And now? A pause. Now I believe in accountability. The words settled between us. I copied the remaining files before disconnecting. I did not promise him anything. He did not ask. When I left the facility, I disabled nothing. I altered nothing. Systems collapse when interfered with abruptly. Exposure works better. Back in my hotel room that night, I organized the evidence into layers. Layer 1, transmission recording confirming survival. Layer 2, isolation logs documenting containment. Layer 3, directive signed by Admiral Thorne authorizing no recovery. Layer 4, internal risk assessment acknowledging continuation. I encrypted duplicates and stored them separately. The next step required precision. I contacted a former colleague now assigned to the Office of the Inspector General. I did not explain over the phone. I requested an in-person meeting under classified review privilege. He agreed without hesitation. In Washington, the building housing the Oversight Office was smaller than the Pentagon, less imposing, more functional. He listened without interrupting as I laid out the evidence on a secure terminal. When the transmission played, he leaned back slowly. "Is this verified?" he asked. "It will be," I said. He scrolled through the isolation logs. "They've maintained administrative death for 30 years, he murmured. "Yes." "And the families?" "Uninformed." He removed his glasses and set them on the desk. "This is catastrophic," he said quietly. "No," I replied. "It's controlled." He looked at me sharply. "You understand what this triggers?" he said. "Yes." "Thorne will be implicated." "Yes." "The Communications Directorate will face inquiry." "Yes." "And you?" "I will be offered discretion." He studied me for a long moment. "Do you want protection?" he asked. "I want documentation entered into record before anyone can erase it." He nodded once. The formal investigation began within 2 weeks. At first, it moved quietly. Closed-door sessions, subpoenaed records, secure briefings. Then someone leaked a fragment. A headline appeared online referencing classified naval personnel declared dead under experimental communications program. The story spread before the department could contain it. Media attention accelerates truth. Admiral Thorne resigned 3 days later, citing health reasons. He did not contact me. A representative from the department requested a private meeting. We sat in a conference room overlooking the Potomac. "You understand the sensitivity," she said carefully. "National security implications remain." "Yes. We can offer you a permanent advisory role, clearance expansion, influence over reform." "In exchange for?" "Measured public narrative." Silence phrased politely. I considered the offer without reacting. "My father was declared dead," I said evenly, "for 30 years." "Yes." "Measured narrative suggests accident. It protects broader stability." "And truth destabilizes?" She did not answer. I declined the offer. The official inquiry concluded with findings of administrative misconduct and concealment of operational failure. The isolation program was terminated. Surviving crew members were formally restored to active legal status. Months later, a government vehicle stopped in front of my mother's house. There was no flag this time. He stepped out slowly, thinner, grayer, but upright. My mother pressed her hand to her mouth. My stepfather remained still. I did not move toward him immediately. He walked up the steps without assistance. "You documented it," he said. "Yes." He nodded once. The folded flag remained on the mantel. It no longer represented death. It represented evidence. The system had chosen convenience over truth. It had assumed no one would look past a short report. It had assumed families would accept closure. It had assumed silence would hold. It did not account for patience. The hearings were closed to the public. That was the compromise. No televised testimony, no live broadcasts of uniformed officers answering for 30 years of silence. The transcripts would exist, archived and sealed for a fixed period, enough to claim transparency, not enough to satisfy spectacle. I sat behind my father in the chamber the first morning. He wore a standard Navy suit provided by the department, not a uniform. That had been part of the negotiation. No decorations, no visual reminders of rank. Just a man who had been declared dead. He looked smaller without insignia. Age had taken weight from him, but his posture remained straight, contained. Admiral Thorne did not attend in person. He submitted a written statement citing medical advice. The committee accepted it without argument. Systems protect their own even when they appear to discipline them. When my father was sworn in, his voice did not tremble. "Captain Daniel Morgan," he said, "United States Navy." A murmur moved through the room at the word captain. It carried more weight now that it had been denied. The questioning was procedural at first. Dates, coordinates, technical parameters of the signal array, the exact duration of the communications distortion event, the recorded neurological assessments following exposure. My father answered without embellishment. He did not accuse. He did not dramatize. He described. The array achieved transmission amplification beyond projected range, he said evenly. Interference occurred across civilian and foreign channels. Risk assessment categorized disclosure as destabilizing. "And the crew?" one committee member asked. "We were placed under containment protocol pending long-term evaluation." "For how long?" 30 years. The number sat in the air. "And during that time, you were legally classified as deceased?" "Yes." "Did you consent to that classification?" He paused. "I followed orders." The committee member leaned forward slightly. "Would you follow them again?" Another pause. Longer this time. "No." There was no emphasis in the word, no anger, just clarity. When it was my turn to testify, I approached the table without notes. They asked how I had discovered the facility. "My father left an access key," I said, "and a directive containing the phrase, 'no recovery.'" "And what did you conclude from that phrase?" "That recovery had been possible." "And that the decision not to attempt it was administrative?" "Yes." They asked whether I had been offered compensation or position in exchange for discretion. "Yes." "And you declined?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because silence corrodes." I did not say it the way my father had. I said, "Because administrative death is not an acceptable substitute for accountability." There was no applause, no reaction beyond the scratch of pens. The inquiry extended for 3 months. Internal reviews exposed layers of authorization beyond Thorne, committees within committees, budget allocations masked as research continuations, psychological assessments designed not to heal but to justify. Other families were notified quietly. Some had built new lives, some had remarried, some had never stopped believing the official report. Reunions were arranged discreetly. Not all of the crew survived the isolation. 2 had died years earlier due to untreated cardiac conditions. Their deaths were recorded only within the containment logs. Those entries felt heavier than any headline. Public reporting intensified despite the closed hearings. Investigative journalists traced procurement contracts back to dormant facilities. Editorial boards questioned oversight structures. Veterans groups demanded reform. The department announced the immediate termination of all similar classified isolation protocols. It sounded decisive. Reform always sounds decisive at first. My father did not move back into my mother's house. That surprised her more than his return. They sat at the kitchen table one evening after the hearings concluded. I stood by the window and listened without appearing to. "I waited," my mother said quietly. "I know," he replied. "They told me you were gone." "Yes, you could have sent something." He did not answer immediately. "We were monitored," he said finally. "Contact was restricted, but you could have tried." He looked at his hands. "I followed orders." The words were the same as before, but this time they felt thinner. My stepfather cleared his throat and stood up. He left the room without speaking. My father did not ask for his place back in the house. Instead, he rented a small apartment near the Naval Yard. Sparse, efficient, temporary. He began working with the Oversight Committee as a consultant on classified program reform. Unpaid at first, then formally contracted. I was offered the same. This time, the terms did not include silence. They included access. I accepted. Reform is not loud work. It involves reviewing documents others prefer unread. It involves identifying language that obscures responsibility. It involves adjusting protocols so that administrative convenience cannot erase a human being. We rewrote the classification procedures for experimental programs. We embedded mandatory external review triggers. We eliminated administrative death status outside of confirmed casualty. It was incremental. It was unglamorous. It was necessary. Admiral Thorne testified privately months later under subpoena. Portions of his statement were eventually released. He described his decision as strategic containment of systemic risk. He never used the word wrong. He resigned permanently from public advisory roles. The folded flag remained on my mother's mantel throughout all of it. She refused to move it. One afternoon, I picked it up and carried it to my father's apartment. He watched without comment as I set it on the small table by his window. "I don't want it back," I said. He nodded. "It's not a memorial," he said quietly. "No, it's a reminder." "Yes." We did not discuss what it reminded us of. Months passed. Public attention shifted. New crises replaced old scandals. Headlines shortened. Commentary moved on. Reform documents do not trend. But within the department, procedures changed. Isolation facilities were audited. Experimental projects required multi-branch oversight. No recovery directives required unanimous sign-off from independent review boards. The phrase itself was amended from "no recovery authorized" to "recovery assessment required." Language matters. One evening, I asked my father whether he regretted not resisting. He stood at the window for a long time before answering. "I believed in structure," he said. "I believed the system would self-correct. And now, I believe systems require interruption." He looked at me when he said it. I understood. My mother eventually visited his apartment. They spoke quietly. They did not resume what had been paused. Too much time had moved between them. My stepfather remained distant, polite, controlled. Families do not restore themselves as easily as reputations. I returned to work fully after the hearings concluded. Consulting on classified program accountability is not a position that invites celebration. It requires patience. It requires memory. The desert facility in Nevada was decommissioned formally under observation, equipment dismantled, servers archived. I visited once before it was closed permanently. The operations room was silent now. No emergency lights flickering, no hum from the racks, just dust. I stood where I had first heard his voice. The world had decided he was gone. It had folded the flag neatly and placed it on a mantel. Closure is efficient. Truth is slower. When I left the building, I did not look back. The gate lowered behind me. Sometimes the world ends things too neatly. Sometimes it writes short reports because it hopes no one will ask for longer ones. Would you have stopped at the folded flag, or would you have looked past it? If this part stayed with you, I invite you to sit with that question and continue with me. After the hearings ended, the silence was different. Not the silence of concealment, not the silence of waiting, a thinner one. Public attention had already begun to drift. New conflicts filled the screens. Fresh outrages demanded commentary. Project Mariner became a phrase used in past tense. Inside the department, however, nothing moved casually anymore. Every experimental authorization passed through 3 separate oversight desks. Every isolation protocol required independent medical review. Recovery assessment language replaced the old directive entirely. No recovery no longer existed in writing. That change mattered more than headlines. I continued working on the Reform Committee 3 days a week. The rest of the time, I returned to consulting on communications infrastructure resilience. The irony was not lost on me. My father worked quietly in a different division. We did not share offices. We did not coordinate schedules. We met once a week in the early evening at a small cafe near the Naval Yard. We did not discuss the past immediately. We discussed systems. How long did they believe the distortion window would remain secret? I asked him once. 10 years, he said. Maybe 15. And after that? They assumed the vulnerability would be obsolete. Was it? He held my gaze. No. We both understood what that meant. The technology behind Mariner had not been dismantled entirely. It had been archived, compartmentalized, studied. I requested access to the archival materials under my new advisory clearance. They resisted at first. Operational sensitivity remains, one director said carefully. Containment ended, I replied. Exposure did not. 3 days later, the archive key was granted. The files were denser than the initial logs I had found in Nevada. Technical schematics, frequency modulation analyses, internal debates between naval engineers and intelligence officials. One memo caught my attention. Subject, secondary deployment feasibility. Date, 18 years after the original incident. The memo suggested limited reactivation of the signal array under revised parameters. I brought it to my father. They didn't stop, I said quietly. He read the page twice before answering. They reduced scale, he said. But no, they did not stop. Were you aware? No. The second deployment had been authorized under a different project name, different classification structure, different leadership, but the core technology was recognizable. This was not about past misconduct. This was about recurrence. I scheduled a meeting with the Inspector General. There are indications of partial reactivation, I said evenly, under a successor designation. He listened without interrupting. You're certain? He asked. Yes. And the parameters? Contained testing, offshore, minimal documentation. He exhaled slowly. Political appetite for another inquiry is limited, he said. Political appetite is not relevant, I replied. Systemic vulnerability remains. He studied me for a moment. You're asking to reopen scrutiny. I'm asking to prevent repetition. He nodded once. A preliminary review began. This time, there was no public scandal, no folded flags, no declared casualties. But there were patterns. Budget allocations masked under maritime communications resilience, equipment transfers routed through intermediary contractors, personnel reassigned quietly. The difference was scale. The difference was oversight. The revised protocols required independent sign-off at multiple levels. The successor project had complied procedurally, but the risk assessment language felt familiar. Acceptable systemic disruption window. Mitigated exposure probability. I brought the phrasing to my father. They still quantify impact in tolerable thresholds, I said. He did not disagree. They believe in calculated risk, he replied. And you? I believe in informed consent. The review committee recommended suspension pending broader evaluation. It was not dramatic. It was not public. It was sufficient. The The secondary deployment was halted before activation. There were no press releases, no resignations, just a line item removed from an internal schedule. Sometimes prevention looks like nothing happening. My mother visited my father more often during this period. They spoke cautiously. Their history remained intact but distant. One evening, she asked me whether I resented her for accepting his death so quickly. I considered the question. No, I said. You didn't question it. I didn't have reason. And if you had known? She lowered her eyes. I would have waited. Waiting is easier when you believe someone is alive, harder when the world confirms otherwise. My stepfather never asked about the investigation. He maintained practical distance, polite, controlled. He removed the candle from beneath the folded flag one afternoon. That part is finished, he said simply. The flag remained, not as mourning, as proof. The Reform Committee dissolved officially 6 months later. Its recommendations were integrated into permanent regulatory structures. My advisory contract was renewed without conditions. My father's status was restored formally to retired officer with full honors. He declined a public ceremony. I don't need applause, he said. Do you need closure? I asked. He thought for a moment. No, he said. I need accuracy. Accuracy is quieter than closure. The desert facility in Nevada was demolished under supervision. I did not attend. I had already heard what I needed to hear there. One afternoon, I received a secure message from the Inspector General. Secondary review concluded. No further unauthorized deployments detected. It was not congratulatory. It was procedural. I read it twice before closing the file. The world would never fully understand Project Mariner. It would remember fragments, headlines, scandals, perhaps a documentary years later. But internally, language had changed. Recovery assessment required. External oversight mandatory. Administrative death prohibited without confirmed remains. Those lines will never trend. They will not be framed on mantles, but they will prevent folded flags from arriving without bodies. My father and I sat by the harbor one evening as the sun lowered into the water. I assumed they would eventually correct it, he said quietly. What? The record. They didn't. No. And you still followed orders. Yes. I watched the tide shift against the dock. Would you again? I asked. He did not answer immediately. Not without question, he said finally. That was enough. Legacy is not medals. It is not folded fabric. It is not the applause withheld or given. It is interruption. It is refusal to accept a short report when you know there should be more pages. It is choosing documentation over convenience. The world decided my father was gone. It printed the summary. It closed the file. But systems are built by people, and people can be asked to account. If the report had been longer, would anyone have read it? If the flag had arrived with a body, would I have searched? Sometimes the difference between history and truth is patience. Would you have looked past the official ending? If this final part stayed with you, I invite you to reflect on that, and to continue listening when stories end too neatly.